I'm getting the thumbs up. I do believe that means it's time for me to begin speaking. Hello, I am John David Berdahl, and I'm an artist, an educator, and an autism advocate here in Moorhead, Minnesota. And I'm going to be talking about today seeing the details first, bottom up thinking, autism, and the power of neurodivergence. And I'm going to share, say URL, share. Here we go, the presentation that I've got. And so there it is. And so I have to begin by saying, besides, hello and thank you so much for joining me, that today I have to talk about something that shapes how I experience the world every single day, bottom-up thinking. This isn't just a theory for me, it's how my brain works. It's how I notice things, how I learn, how I create, and sometimes how some struggle. My goal today is to explain what bottom-up thinking is, how it shows up in autism, and why it's not something to fix, but something to understand and value. And so, so often, autism is explained in terms of what's missing or what's wrong. But a lot of what we call autistic traits are really differences in how information is processed. Bottom-up thinking is one of those differences. When we understand it, we stop asking, why is this person struggling with something so simple, and start asking, what kind of environment or communication would actually support this brain? That shifts everything. In education, in workplaces, and in relationships. And I can speak to that myself as soon as I had realized that I was a bottom-up thinker, that I noticed more details, so much more than the bigger picture per se. That really did just alter how it was that I did engage the world and interact with others. So bottom-up thinking means starting with details and sensory information first, instead of jumping straight to the big picture. Meaning is built piece by piece. For me, that means I notice patterns, sounds, textures, or inconsistencies before I understand the overall situation. This isn't slow thinking, it's detailed thinking, it's careful thinking, and it often leads to deep understanding, just on a different timeline. And I can speak to working with clients and working with students, and they do talk about how family and friends and coworkers would like them to just know something immediately. And I'm about to get to bottom up thinking versus top down thinking, but I do have an example, and it actually took me a little while to think about, how is it that I ought to describe this very quickly to some individuals who perhaps haven't considered different types of thinking themselves. Now, remember, and I'll finish with this last point, this slide anyway, it's not slow thinking, what we're talking about. It's not slow thinking, it's detailed driven thinking. Okay, so please do keep that in mind. There we go. And so, there, go back. Bottom-up thinking versus top-down thinking. A helpful way to understand this is by comparing bottom-up and top-down thinking. Okay, understanding bottom-up thinking itself. Top-down thinking starts with concepts, expectations, or assumptions, then fits details into that framework. Bottom-up thinking does the opposite. It starts with what's actually there and lets meaning emerge. Most people use both styles, but many autistic people, myself included, default to bottom-up processing, and problems often happen when the world assumes everyone is top-down or a top-down thinker. Now, the example that I was supposed to offer about, I guess, the difference between bottom-up and top-down thinking, or those different types of styles. I was actually visiting a hospital here in Fargo, or I was a visitor there. It's called Sanford. And they had this very large building, very, very nice. Many floors, many, many floors. And I went to one of the windows on the 6th floor, and I was looking out at Fargo, North Dakota, which is right next to where I am, Moorhead, Minnesota. And as I was looking out the window and I knew this presentation was going to be coming up, I had thought to myself, how am I supposed to describe the difference between bottom-up thinking and top-down thinking? And I was looking out the window and I saw the city, and I saw all the cars and all of the buildings and all of the roads, and I saw everyone heading to and fro from one place to another. And I realized that I was actually, that's an example of top-down thinking. Literally, I was looking out a window from the top of this building, or near the top, down, I was looking at everything that was going on, and I could see everything that was happening, although I could not see every detail. Now, when you're walking on the street or on the sidewalk, you can see more of the details, but you can't see where every road goes, or how tall every building is, or what building is next to what other building or some other building. And so that's the example that I offer to you now. Bottom up thinking is very much as if you're walking on a sidewalk and you can see the names of businesses, the faces of the individuals driving cars, what type of cars that they're driving, and I suppose what speed they're actually going on the road. Whereas with top down thinking, you can see, yes, what building is next to another building, what road connects with another road. You can see these larger sort of, I guess, structures. And now I'm getting a little more figurative. And I must say that that must be an incredible way to process information. It's not a way that I myself have really done. I mean, I've become adept at not convincing people that I can do that, but getting very close to doing that by ascertaining or really examining all of the details and how it is that they do connect. And one phrase that you'll hear me say is don't isolate, integrate. And so that's one way that I've made certain to understand the world around me, is that I haven't just isolated separate pieces of information or separate sort of specifics, and I've actually integrated them all into a larger sort of view or viewpoint of the world. Okay, so autism and the brain. Research supports this lived experience. Studies show that autistic brains often process sensory and perceptual information more intensely and more precisely. There's less automatic filtering of background input and more attention to local details. This doesn't mean something is broken. It means the brain is prioritizing accuracy and detail over speed and assumption. And so do keep that in mind. Detail first processing rather than cognitive impairment. This isn't something that is a deficit. Yes, it definitely is a difference, but it's one of those autistic traits that can definitely be a superpower when aimed, I suppose, when categorized or classified or really recognized and aimed in a very meaningful or intentional sort of way. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, key research models. There are a few research models that help explain this. The enhanced perceptual functioning model suggests autistic perception is often stronger, not weaker. The updated weak central coherence theory shows that global meaning isn't missing. It just doesn't happen automatically. And predictive processing theories suggest autistic brains rely less on assumptions and more on raw data. And that's very, very true. I've talked with some other autistic individuals who are about level 1, just like myself, don't need too much support. And we will talk about how we don't have all the variables, perhaps, or we don't have all the information to make an informed choice or decision about something. And that's so very, very much. We'll just either pause or stop or we won't continue to interact or participate in one, I guess, action or one sort of task or another until it is so that we do fully understand what it is that we're supposed to be doing and why it is that we're supposed to be doing it. And overall, I do believe that is a very healthy way that it is that we ought to conduct ourselves. And once again, I ought to admit that global meaning, or I ought to state that global meaning isn't missing. Okay, global meaning isn't missing or delayed. It's not absent. Okay, it just doesn't happen automatically. And that's some of the work that we have to put in as autistic individuals to make certain that that does become a little more automatic. That we get more than just context, but the meaning of the situation. And that's so very important. That's what I've imparted to clients and students, and I do believe audiences as well. Okay, lived experience. Here's what that feels like from the inside. Okay. The world comes to me in pieces. Sounds, visual patterns, textures, they all arrive at once. Meaning takes time, but when it forms, it's solid. I don't skip the big picture, I build it. And once it's built, it tends to be very accurate because it's based on what's actually there, not what I assumed would be there. All right, and that's very key. All right, the big picture is built, not skipped. All right, but it does take time. And that can be very difficult for some or challenging for others. The time it takes for some of us to process and, I suppose, synthesize, I hope, an opinion about one situation or another, or one circumstance or another. In previous conversations or in previous discussions, I have talked about how it is that I do experience very intensely alexithymia with the classic sort of autism that I was diagnosed with. And so I don't really, to say I don't have an opinion about anything isn't necessarily true, because I understand now that I ought to have an opinion about one sort of subject or topic, or maybe consequence or another. And so I make certain to, I guess, demonstrate that, or express that sort of opinion that I am supposed to have on one subject or another. And that is sort of the synthesis that I've arrived at, or synthesizing. And I don't get too overwhelmed. It's just sometimes I definitely experience not a type of paralysis or avoidance, or too much uncertainty, because I have experienced, or I've been exposed to enough. I've been exposed to my environment enough to make very quick decisions, and very useful and very beneficial choices. But just, yeah, I don't skip the big picture. And that's something that we ought to make certain that we do know and do offer our autistic family members and, I suppose, learners, that if we do give them the time, that they very, very much and very accurately will come to a conclusion about one sort of, I guess, series of events, or set of data, or what have you, and they will accomplish so much if we do give them the time to arrive at that sort of place or that sort of understanding. There we go. So now we'll talk about strengths. This way of thinking comes with real strengths. Many bottom-up thinkers excel at pattern recognition, deep focus, precision, and creative problem solving. We often notice inconsistencies others miss. We see connections that aren't obvious. These aren't niche skills. They're valuable across art, science, technology, education, really anywhere accuracy and insight matter, which is in a lot of different areas, a lot of different fields. And that's where I found that I am invaluable and I am indispensable, as a board member, when I am included, or advisory council member, board member, what discussion participants, educational sort of, and conferences. In fact, with healthcare too, or in caregiving. When I talk about clients, working with some clients, they definitely rely on me as a support professional or care assistant to retain so much information and explain so much information and to process so many of the details, whereas they are very much, a lot of people are idea people. They will state that they, are very good at generating ideas and offering sorts of alternatives and choices, or options and they are very, very adept or very skilled at envisioning so much, but executing it can be very difficult for them. And bottom-up thinkers can be very, very helpful in grounding them and offering them all of these sort of elements that they need to build, or construct a very firm and very reliable foundation for their ideas, or for what it is that they've envisioned. Creativity and innovation. One reason bottom-up thinking fuels creativity is that fewer assumptions are imposed up front. Instead of starting with, this is how it's done, we start with, what's actually here? That opens the door to new frameworks, new art forms, and new solutions. A lot of innovation doesn't come from thinking faster. It comes from thinking differently. So keep that in mind. A lot of people, do believe that they bring in concerning creativity and innovation and invention. They seek to compete with other individuals or other creators or innovators or makers. And that competition isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it isn't necessarily or wholly a good thing. Because while it is that they are racing to some sort of, there we go, achievement, or completion, yes, they are skipping or not noticing very, very crucial and very, very vital sort of new emergent properties. And I talk about that quite a bit in presentations and in classes that I do offer, the emergent properties that do arise or that do evolve or show up when it is that you do include an autistic individual or someone who's on the spectrum. When you include just a bottom-up thinker, setting autism aside, when you include someone who is detail-oriented, it just allows for so much new. When you take something that hadn't necessarily been connected or associated with something else, and you do bring them together, yes, there are so many different facets and aspects, and items that can just pop up that you hadn't even thought, that perhaps you hadn't even considered would be connected as well, or associated as well, or tied together, or that would blossom, or be birthed from that sort of combination. And that's, I do talk about how it's just amazing. It's supposed to be amazing to me. ADHD individuals or individuals who identify as ADHD or even ADD, how they can just smash ideas together sometimes. And you can't see me literally taking hands and smashing them, these hands and smashing them together, but how they can juxtapose so many different ideas, or so many different objects together. And just out of that, out of that smashing or out of that sort of union, comes so much, comes so many different, and so many new ideas and new possibilities. It's just astounding. It's absolutely astounding. Let's skip to the next. Okay, where challenges arise. Challenges usually don't come from bottom-up thinking itself. They come from environments that weren't designed for it. There we go. Bright lights, constant noise, vague instructions. And I'll read that one again. Vague or abstract instructions or expectations. And that's not some sort of slight, but in a world that is dominated by neurotypical thinkers, a lot of explanations and expectations and a lot of situations to us autistic individuals or bottom-up thinkers, detail-oriented, right? Individuals can be very vague and very broad and very general and very confusing. Okay. And so unspoken expectations as well, that can be troubling, or that can be a hindrance, and pressure to respond quickly. All of these create friction. When clarity is replaced by assumption, bottom-up thinkers are the ones, there we go, who pay the cost. And I can say that I do still experience this, and I know if that situation frustrates. What situation is that? When clarity is replaced by assumption, okay? But we ought to be fair, and we ought to show, I guess, the rest of the world, or holistic individuals, neurotypical individuals, some grace and offer them some forgiveness, because with top-down thinking, that's still a lot of information that's being taken in. And yes, it's a lot of assumptions, but it is a wider and larger view. And I do believe that those of us who are on the spectrum or identify as autistic sometimes don't take into consideration, because we're not, maybe theory of mind hasn't been achieved completely for those of us. Perhaps it hasn't been achieved for all members of a part of a conversation or whatnot, or some sort of discussion, right? Or session. But individuals on the spectrum or who identify as autistic ought to show holistic or neurotypical individuals some grace or some forgiveness, and offer them some space with these assumptions that are talked about. And yes, it can make things difficult for those of us who are autistic, who identify as autistic, that they are speaking in very broad, or very sort of big and large and very nebulous. There we go. Very nebulous sorts of terms because they don't understand it completely themselves. And that's what I do mean is that to demand that they offer clarity when something isn't clear to them is something that we ought to consider. And we ought to give them a moment to understand this larger picture or understand what it is that they're seeing out of this window, concerning this example that I just offered, or concerning the example, looking out a window and seeing the entire city or seeing the landscape. They do need a moment to see the landscape, and offer us details. And we have to, take a moment and process those details and then form a sort of landscape or a picture based on that, what it is that we are being offered. So do take that into consideration that there are challenges on both sides of bottom-up and top-down thinking. Here we go. And so sensory overload. Sensory overload is one of those most misunderstood parts of autism because more sensory data reaches conscious awareness. The system gets overwhelmed faster. It's not about being weak or dramatic. And you may have heard this before. It's about bandwidth. Okay? When everything is loud, bright, or competing for attention, the brain simply runs out of processing capacity. And I have yet to really experience overload myself. It's not to say that I don't ever, as far as I know, I can be overstimulated. And I go, I guess this is me being, this is me showing you that I'm a bottom-up thinker and that I am being, I'm making a distinction between being overwhelmed and overstimulated and overloaded. And so there have been a couple instances where, there has been a lot of information, and I'm not really certain where it is that I'm supposed to put that information inside of this head. And I suppose there have been some times where I have had to reboot like a computer does, but there hasn't really been a meltdown for me. There hasn't been an emotional sort of crisis that I've gone through. It's been more of a pause and a reset for me, or a stop and a reset. But yeah, I have seen overload in others, and it is, I don't know about not very pretty, but it's not something that, and to meltdowns and very disruptions in the lives of others, and how it is that they do interact with the world, and how it is that they are definitely processing and interpreting so much of this. And yeah, I've seen that, and hopefully, more conversations are had about that, and less sort of blame is really placed on others because they do experience that. And I do believe, overload, I ought to read at the bottom, yes, that overload is a neurological response, not a lack of resilience, and recovery does require reducing input. And so hopefully individuals can self-soothe and find calming or soothing or quiet spaces to work through what it is that perhaps does have them feeling one way or another, or behaving one way or another that they don't approve of, especially. Okay, so social communication. Social interaction is another area where bottom-up processing shows up. A lot of social communication relies on implication and shared assumptions. Bottom-up thinkers often process words literally first and need explicit information. And I can attest to that. I am definitely a literal thinker. I don't know about a black and white one, but I am definitely a literal one. And so humor was something, not so much that I didn't understand or that I didn't get, but it was something that it would take a while for me to understand, like, what was not the point of the humor or the joke, maybe, but what was the function? What was the function of the joke or of the humor or the aside or the anecdote or whatever it was? And I don't know if I've mastered humor myself, but I got really lucky in that I have a father who I will be visiting in about 5 minutes, who really educated me, who really just showed me, explained so much to me, modeled so much for me when it comes to humor, because he is a performer and a broadcaster on television and radio, and he was a performer on stage, a musician, but still in front of an audience or in front of a crowd. And so he really was a master, is a master of, I suppose, working a room and holding the attention of others and guiding the sort of focus of others, and the concentration of others. And he's really just a great showman, and he showed me so much. And so I learned a lot about humor that way, and that really allowed me to, I suppose, become a more abstract thinker, but also to understand the function and the value of levity, in a serious, or in a but not a crushing or shattering sort of situation, but in a very tense and intense sort of situation. That was, I had to say thank you so much. I had to be so grateful to my father for doing that. When expectations, again, about social communication, or continuing with that, when expectations aren't stated clearly, misunderstandings happen, not because we don't care, but because we're missing data. Now, supporting bottom-up thinkers. Okay, the good news is that support doesn't have to be complicated. Clear instructions, written communication, predictable routines, reduced sensory load, and explicit expectations go a long way. These aren't special favors, they're access tools. And when environments are clearer, everyone benefits, not just autistic individuals. All right, and neurodiversity as strength. All right. So no society thrives on one way of thinking. We need people who see details, who detect patterns, who go deep instead of wide, who question assumptions. Neurodivergent minds contribute to progress precisely because they don't follow default paths. Diversity of thought isn't a problem to manage, it's a strength to cultivate. All right. So, key takeaway. All right. What is the key takeaway? The main thing that I ought to leave you with is this: autistic bottom-up thinking is not broken. It's not incomplete. And it's not something that needs to be corrected. Let me read that again, okay? And let me say that again. It's not something that needs to be corrected. We do not need to be fixed because of this. All right. I do believe we ought to fix ourselves, though, on a destination, right? On a goal, on a purpose, right? And then achieve that sort of goal. It's a different way of processing the world, one that brings depth, accuracy, creativity, and insight. When we understand and respect it, we make space for people like me to thrive, not by changing who we are, but by meeting us halfway. Okay, thank you so much for listening today. I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'm going to show up there. And so, yeah, this has been I've been having so many conversations recently about this topic or about this subject, and I do believe that about this subject or about this topic, and it's just been blowing individuals' minds. I've known about it for quite a long time, bottom up thinking, because I am a bottom up thinker, and hopefully that example that I did just offer, looking out a window, and here looks like the sun is coming up here, so that's hopefully I've offered you quite a bit of illumination, and this has been so very positive for me and so very helpful for me to take this moment or take this time to talk about, this trait, this autistic trait, and hopefully, you do watch this or do listen to what it was, maybe in the future or on your own time or in your own time, and really consider, yes, how it is that we do interact or how it is that we do get along, with all of this information sort of bombarding us. This is a certain time and this is a certain age when we're producing so much content. I think I had heard we're producing so much more content than we'll ever be able to consume or watch or listen to. And so I think that's just phenomenal that we can take a moment and take a breath, right? And maybe become or allow ourselves to be sort of bottom-up thinkers just for a moment. We think about some of or take some time to think about some of these details in some of these specifics and some of these facts, right? And some of this evidence, that we're being offered about one, sort of circumstance or one sort of situation or one sort of scenarios or scenes, that we're noticing, and living more intentional lives and living more connected lives. And that's why I present for Autism Connect. Thank you so much for allowing me to connect with you and to connect with others. And that there is nothing about us without us, to be included and to be, offered this space and this time to definitely talk about how it is that I do, I guess, exhibit or manifest this characteristic of autism. I don't really say symptoms anymore. And I think the next presentation that hopefully I can offer and very, very soon is how autism and neurodivergent, sort of perspectives and lifestyles are becoming just that, a lifestyle, more so than a diagnosis or an illness or a disorder. They're becoming their own cultures. And what we're having now, it seems, is more of a cross-cultural conversation, instead of a conversation about wellness and health. And so hopefully you will join me for that. I do believe it ought to go very, very well. Looks like my time is about up. And yeah, looks like there's no questions right now. There may be in the future, though, so go ahead and reach out or leave messages. I can be reached on social media at Really John David, because I'm really John David. And email to johndavidberdahl@gmail.com. Thank you so much once again for allowing me to speak on this subject today. And hopefully this has been helpful or beneficial or rewarding, and allows you to think in a very different way and see things in a very different way, seeing all of the details. So thank you so much.